Hello everyone, it's Chris here from Charity Digital and welcome back to another webinar day. We're still very much flying high from last week's digital fundraising day. We're totally overwhelmed by the turnout. Almost 1,000 charity professionals joined us for a day of webinars, podcasts, videos and ebooks from amazing charity and tech speakers. The likes of WWF, Comic Relief, Trillium and Life will also take part. All our content from the day is now available on the site digitalfundraisingday.org.uk. So for those of you looking to relive the day, tune in any sessions you missed or just share your favorite pieces with your colleagues. You can do so as of today. We also use the day to announce our 2020 Be More Digital conference. We had an amazing turnout at last year's Charity Digital Tech conference. And we want to take that one step further and I plan to go even bigger again this year at the London Olympia Conference Centre on March 5th. We'll have 4 streams: leadership, data, service delivery and growth. And they'll all include sessions from charity and tech experts, with the goal being to help ease the pressures of that big scary word, digital transformation. We essentially want to help organisations of all sizes just be more digital. I'm naturally biased, of course, but it does promise to be a super resourceful and educational day for any charity. And if you're interested, you can head over to charitydigital.org.uk/Be More Digital 2020 to register your interest. Today's webinar rounds off our cybersecurity series for the year. We've already had 4 amazing webinars from CUB, looking at how to keep your charity cyber secure, 5 steps to improve your cybersecurity, how to set up a risk management regime, and how to prevent cyber attacks. In each of those webinars, I think we mentioned the frightening statistic that around 40% of charities aren't aware they're at risk of cybercrime. And the goal of today's webinar is that now we have all this knowledge, how can we get the people in our organisations to take notice and act? Before I hand over to CUB, a quick reminder that we'll be hosting a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so make sure you stick around for that. If you want to ask a question, you can do so at any time by hitting the Q&A button at the center of the bottom center of your screen. If we happen to run out of time before your question is asked, we do record all the answers, and once we wrap up, and we add them to the recording of the webinar that we do share via email and put up on our site in the next week or so. So that's enough for me for now. I'd like to hand over to CUB. Welcome back.
Thanks, Chris. A lot of the guidance we're going to talk through today is going to be based around our cybersecurity toolkit for boards. Now, that doesn't mean if you're not a board member on today's webinar that this won't apply to you, because the purpose of today's webinar is to get people to understand how to communicate as one within their organization about security, so that the technical colleagues, the senior leadership and the board aren't talking in 3 completely different languages when it comes to cybersecurity. So today's rough agenda, the full guidance is available at that link, which we'll send out afterwards as well. But today's agenda is going to go through initially, what do leaders know? So the topics that we're going to cover are: what do you care about as an organization? What is the cyber threat specifically to charities? What's the impact of a cyber incident on your organization likely to be? What are you doing to manage the risks? And we'll talk about a couple of options under that bit. Should you be seeking further assurance? So this is looking at whether you need to go for any level of certification or perhaps any greater assurance on your own cybersecurity. And then critically, are you prepared for the worst to happen? The news features constantly stories of cyber attacks taking place on businesses, on government, on charities. And the last section we'll talk about is, are you prepared for that to happen to yourself? So we start with what we care about as an organization. For us, we use a term called the crown jewels, and that essentially just means understanding what you care about, and is it one of those things that really are essential for your organization to operate. So it's quite easy to break these down. The first of which is, most charities probably hold bulk personal data. For you, that might be a really significant list of supporters, it might be your donors, it might be your beneficiaries, and particularly if you're working with more vulnerable beneficiaries, you might not, you might have very sensitive data as part of that you wouldn't want being stolen by criminals. Most charities have money's needed to operate, but that's probably pretty critical to the running of your organization. If you're research charity, you may hold intellectual property. Now, there are people out there who want to get their hands on intellectual property, not do the hard work that you've done to find out about that treatment, that drug, whatever it might be, and will try and steal that from your organization and sell it online. Your public-facing website might be really critical to your organization. It may be the place where you give out your advice, your guidance, or just that point of contact between you and your beneficiaries. But underpinning all of these things is a reputation. A reputation takes years to build and seconds to destroy. And a poorly managed cyber attack could have a really detrimental effect on your reputation, particularly if you lost perhaps data on your beneficiaries or perhaps supporters, and they no longer want to be associated with the charity. That said, when we come on to why you prepared for the worst to happen later, we'll talk you through how to put in place some sensible measures to prepare for an incident. So all of those things have the potential of being your crown jewels, your most valuable assets for your charity. But it's really important before you go into any of the technical stuff around cybersecurity to understand which of those you're trying to protect, because the way you protect bulk personal data is slightly different to perhaps how you protect money or intellectual property. And it's important to understand which of those you do care about most so that you can then prioritize the pieces of cybersecurity controls that you want to prioritize in your organization. So what is the cyber threat to charities? The first question is, why are charities at risk? So we talked a little bit just then about crown jewels. All of those things have a value to cyber criminals, whether you're holding money, data, intellectual property. All of those things have a value to other people in the same way they have a value to you, but people will want to steal those and sell them. And we've seen charities fall victim to a wide variety of cyber attacks, anything from really simple email phishing attacks through to sort of much more devastating ransomware attacks. And we'll come on to a few more of those in a second. But charities are being attacked because they hold something that is of value to cyber criminals. So who are charities at risk from? I used the term cyber criminals a second ago, and that essentially refers to those who are motivated by money. For them, this is a job, this is a career. It's not a great career, but it's still a career for them. And they want to take money from your organization. But in doing that, they apply quite a business-focused methodology to it. So they will look at something and go, is it going to take us more in our time and investment to steal whatever it might be from your organization than we'll actually get out in the end? Essentially a cost-benefit analysis. And if you make it difficult enough for them to, difficult enough that they can't get in easily, chances are they'll go elsewhere and they'll leave your organization alone. The next question is how charities are being attacked. So I mentioned something called business email compromise. That's essentially where people are compromising the email accounts of normally quite senior staff, and they're using those to then trick staff into doing something, pretending to be that senior person. So it might be that they perhaps get into the account, the email account of the finance manager or the chief exec, and they'll send an invoice pretending to be that person to the finance team or whoever processes that. And it'll look perfectly legitimate, it will follow the processes, but then actually all of that money gets transferred out into a completely illegitimate bank account. And unfortunately, a lot of charities have lost significant amounts of money in that kind of attack. We've seen ransomware attacks, so those kinds of attacks where all of your systems get locked down, and unfortunately you're not able to get at any of the data or use any of the systems. And they can be really devastating, and you'll typically get a message from the attackers saying, if you give us 3 Bitcoin or something like that, we'll give you a magical key to unlock it. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the time they don't have the key. Their key may not work on your systems, or it might be an awful lot of work to actually recover from it. So we always encourage, in those kind of scenarios, report it to the police through action fraud, and seek advice from them depending on the circumstances that you're in. We've also seen attacks where people are trying to exfiltrate data. So I mentioned that bulk personal data might be one of your crown jewels. We've seen attacks where criminals have tried to take significant chunks of data, because they then use that data to then sell on to other criminals who might use it to extort or defraud individual members of the public using that data. But the key here is, what does all that mean to your leaders? It means essentially that charities have things of value, that people are trying to take those from them, and that there is a potentially significant impact, but they need to now understand what that impact is to be able to make a sensible risk assessment. So what's the impact of a cyber attack? It could be loss of data or money, and the effect that that loss might have on your organization. It's very hard to quantify that in any real way without it having happened to your organization. But losing, for some charities, even a few £1,000s could be detrimental to their ability to operate. Since the introduction of GDPR, there is obviously an increased fear around regulatory action. So if you've perhaps had a whole load of data stolen or corrupted, or you're not sure that it's been kept confidential enough, it could be that the Information Commissioner's Office is going to get involved. Now, in those scenarios, we'd obviously encourage early reporting and making sure that within 72 hours of becoming aware, you've told the ICO. They won't need all of the details at the beginning, but making sure you report to them early is going to help you in that scenario. There's also the possibility that the Charity Commission may want to get involved. And if you're not taking sensible precautions, they may have some regulatory action that they want to take. A cyber attack is pretty likely to lead to some level of decreased output or your inability to deliver some of the aims of the charity. And that could be, again, because of loss of data or money. And it means that you're no longer in a position to be able to deliver all the services that you've said that you'll deliver, or that your charity is set up to do. And I mentioned it earlier, but reputational damage is likely to be one of the really significant impacts, particularly if you don't then handle the cyber attack that's happened well, and can't evidence to your supporters, your beneficiaries, to regulators, that you took sensible precautions in the first place. So we'll come on to what those precautions might be, but reputational damage is often the one that charities say to us is most critical when it comes to the impact of a cyber attack. So the next question as an organization you need to ask yourselves is, what are we doing to manage that risk? And this question needs to be asked both at a trustee level, at a senior leadership level, and of course within the technical community that is actually instigating the work on that, those technical controls. So the first thing might be nothing. Anyone who works in risk will understand that nothing is sometimes the appropriate course of action to take. If it's going to cost you more to do something than it's ever going to cost you in terms of the damage that something might cause if a risk materializes, then doing nothing might be the most sensible course of action. In cyber, it's very rarely the right course of action, because the next thing you might be doing to manage that risk is technical controls. Now, depending on the size of your organization, we've got some different guidance that might be relevant to your organization. So one of our earliest webinars was looking at the Small Charity Guide. And that's 5 really simple, quick, easy, low cost controls that you can put in place to better protect your small charity. And you can do that with very, very limited technical knowledge at all. If you're not familiar with that guidance, I definitely encourage you to go back. I think it was webinar number 2, and have a look at that guidance and see if you've got those controls in place. Now, if you're a larger organization, it's worth having a look at our 10 steps to cybersecurity. As I said, the Small Charity Guide is 5, 10 steps is obviously 10 areas to focus on. And it's a little bit more in depth. It looks around how you're securing your systems in a slightly more complex way. And it puts in place a few more policies and procedures that you should be following for good practice. But it's important that the board and the senior leadership understand what those technical controls you've got in place are and how they're helping you to look after the crown jewels. So you'll see as we go through this, all of these things need to link back to how you're protecting those things that matter to you most. If you're bolting on security measures just because it seems like a good idea, it's not taking the approach that you need to around making sure that the things that are most critical to your charity are the things that are best protected. Now, some charities don't have a dedicated IT person, almost definitely don't have a dedicated cybersecurity person. So it might be that you need to bring in expertise, and that might take the form of bringing in someone perhaps on a fixed term contract, or bringing in some consultancy to give you some advice on where to start. And that shouldn't just be at the technical end. That advice should be something that's shared with senior leadership, with the board, because that's advising them on how you bring all this back to your crown jewels. And the board should really set what they want that person to really be focusing on in terms of that expertise and what they prioritize. But it might be in the form of consultancy, it might be staff, or it might be having a chat with some of the bodies that represent charities in the sector and seeing if they know of any charities that are really leading the way in this area, and might be able to just give you some informal advice of how they've protected their crown jewels. So one of the key things that the board should definitely be aware of is what measures are in place to build staff awareness and set a culture around cybersecurity. So one of the things we've seen people do before is run simulated phishing tests on their organization. And those are those tests where you're sending out a fake phishing email, so a fake spam email to a number of your staff, perhaps all your staff, and you're measuring how many people open the email, click on the links, perhaps even fill in a form that you've given them to try and capture some data off them. And those are really important. It's a really good way of understanding how aware your staff are of how to spot phishing emails, but they are becoming increasingly difficult to spot. And what is really important if you're going to run tests like that is to make sure that anyone that does get caught out by those fake phishing emails, or indeed a real phishing email, isn't blamed for doing something wrong. We're trying to encourage everybody to take a really positive approach to staff awareness and making sure that their staff trust that if they do click on a link, if they do accidentally fill in some details on a form online, they know that there is somewhere in your organization they can turn to tell them, tell you what's happened, and that they're not going to get blamed. Because if you blame your staff or make them feel like it was them that did something wrong, as opposed to criminals which have essentially tried to steal something from you, they're not going to report again in the future, and they're not going to be champions for cybersecurity within your organization. So the board can help set that culture. Most culture comes from the top down, and they need to be setting the tone on that. So perhaps even having your senior leaders, or perhaps even a trustee, talk about an experience they've had of where they've perhaps either got caught out or nearly got caught out about a phishing email or a scam in some way. Is a really easy way to do that. We've also now released something called Top Tips for Staff, which is a 20-minute e-learning resource that you can use within your charity to help just give your staff, your trustees, your volunteers, a little bit of awareness of the types of things that they should be on the lookout for and how they can help the organization be more secure. The next bit, and the final bit around how to manage risk that we'll cover today, is collaborating with your suppliers and partners. So we've seen a lot of cyber attacks across the UK where actually it didn't start with your organization. It started with someone in your supply chain, and that could be someone supplying anything from potentially quite innocuous things like perhaps your stationery, but you have a relationship with them. It could be someone providing IT services or software or things like that. All of these things form part of your supply chain. And you then have all of those strategic partners that you work with. So it might be organizations that you deliver services with and things like that. All of those organizations, because you work really closely with them, have quite privileged access to your organization. If you receive an email from that organization, you generally trust it. Because of that, they are a potential route for cyber criminals to exploit to get into another organization. So it may be that you want to mandate a particular security standard for anyone that you want to work with. It might be that you want to have a sort of common way of working that everybody understands. But it's really important to make sure that as part of any agreement you have with a supplier or partner, everybody knows what their responsibilities are, and that you actually have an open dialogue. So if one of your suppliers has a cyber attack, they come to you really openly and say, look, this has happened to us, you should be aware of it, just in case it has any negative effects on you. But that openness and transparency is really important to making sure that everybody can have an open conversation about cybersecurity and make sure that a cyber attack on one doesn't have an effect on everyone else. So we get asked a lot, should we be seeking further assurance within your organization around your cybersecurity? And the first question I'd always ask is why? What is it that you want assurance about? Is it that you want assurance that you're doing the right thing? Is it that you are going for a contract that requires you to have a particular security standard to be able to bid for it? Or is it that you've had something that's made you feel a bit uneasy and you just want that external validation that you are on the right track and that you've got sensible precautions in place? So the first thing you might want to do to seek that further assurance is testing. So you could do that through one of the simulated phishing tests. You might want to do it through penetration testing. So where you essentially invite a company in to come and effectively hack your systems and see how easy it is. And what they'll do is they'll then produce a report for you that tells you where your vulnerabilities are, where you can do a little bit more. And we have a certified scheme for that on the NCIC website. If you go to the products and services, we have a number of certified penetration testing companies who do it to a standard that we've set, and you can be assured that they will do a good job as a result. It might be that you want to do a bit of an internal review. So if you're a particularly small organization, or it's just that you want to kind of really make sure that you're in line with the guidance, depending on the size of your charity, you might want to consider having an internal review against the small charity guide, 10 steps to cybersecurity, or if you're particularly focusing on data, have a look at our GDPR security outcomes, which lays out how to make sure that your security is in line with the principles of GDPR, and you can evidence, should there be a cyber attack, that you were prioritizing your security in line with what GDPR has said. If perhaps the reason for wanting some further assurances that you're going for a contract, or you really want that independent review of what your cybersecurity is like, you've got a number of standards that you can have a look at. So Cyber Essentials, this is one run by the UK government, NCIC sets the standard for it. And it's actually just been announced that it's relaunching under one Cyber Essentials accreditation body. That should hopefully simplify the certification process a little bit for you. But Cyber Essentials is a really good standard to test some of the most common internet-borne cyber attacks and how well you're prepared against them. And increasingly, that is a standard that a lot of larger organizations are setting as the minimum standard for organizations' cybersecurity to work with them. So it's definitely worth having a look into, particularly if you're looking at bidding for local or central government contracts. You've then got ISO 27001. It's a bit more of a complex standard to achieve, but certainly one that's achievable for quite a lot of charities. And it just takes it a little bit further than Cyber Essentials and focuses on some different areas of controls outside of just online born cyber attacks. And then you have something called NIST. This is actually an American standard, but if your organization is operating internationally a lot, it's definitely one worth considering, because where you want to bid for contracts or funding from other countries, they might be setting NIST as the standard. But it's definitely worth considering if you are bidding for contracts, whether it's worth getting some certification in place before you're asked for it, because they're not they're not immediate in terms of being able to just go, right, we're going to go for Cyber Essentials and then get it the next day. Chances are you're probably going to have to do a little bit of work off the back of the assessment to make sure that you hit all of the criteria. So it's worth doing as soon as you can to make sure you're ready for when those tenders or contracts go out for bidding. So the next bit that I said I'd kind of cover is, are we prepared for the worst to happen? And this is essentially saying, if a cyber attack were to take place, is our organization prepared? And the first question to kind of ask yourself as part of this is, would we even know if there's an incident? So who would we rely on to tell us that a cyber attack has taken place? Now, if your website goes down, you're probably going to notice that yourselves. But the question to ask here is, do we have any monitoring in place? So do we know when someone tries to access our network from outside of the organization? Do we know if there's unusually high traffic coming towards our website? So I think a lot of you will have probably seen in the news the last couple of days that a number of political parties have had what's known as a DDoS attack, so a distributed denial of service attack. And that's essentially where a whole load of traffic is pushed to a website at a moment in time. And the aim of those people doing it is to get it to crash, to get it to stop working. Now, would you be aware if somebody began that process of trying to push a lot of traffic towards your website? And if not, it's worth considering whether you need to put in place some monitoring systems to understand that. There is some more in-depth guidance as part of the 10 steps to cybersecurity as to what those monitoring systems might be. Is there a plan? Most organizations have a plan for what to do in the event of a fire, a flood, a power outage for their organization, staff going off sick. A lot of organizations don't have a plan for a cyber attack. And unfortunately, we've heard some horror stories where even where people do have a plan for what to do in the event of a cyber attack, they've then suffered a ransomware attack, and the only place that the plan was saved was on the system that is now completely locked down and inaccessible. So if there is a plan, it's worth making sure that everybody that's going to be needed as part of that plan is aware of what the plan says, where it is, and whose role it is to instigate that plan in the event of a cyber attack. One of the things that plan should definitely cover is who you need to report to. So within the sort of cybersecurity landscape, if it's a live cyber attack, you should report it to Action Fraud, which is the live 24/7 policing line for cyber and fraud. If it's likely to be a data breach that affects the rights and freedoms of individuals in the United Kingdom or the EU, you need to report to the Information Commissioner's Office. And most of you will probably know, but the Charity Commission, as your regulator for the sector, also have a reporting a serious incident form on their website. And that's where any incident, not just cyber, is likely to affect your ability to operate as a charity or going to have a negative effect on the sector as a whole. You need to report that through their website. It's a much more simplified process now. It's all an online form. So if you just visit their website and put in RSI, that should all come up. In terms of that preparation for the worst to happen, the leadership really need to understand what their role is. So chances are, in the event of an actual cyber attack, the IT team, IT person, or perhaps your third-party provider for your IT, they're going to be pretty focused on resolving whatever it is that's gone wrong technically, and trying to get the organization back up and running as quickly as possible. The leadership are going to want to understand what their role is. Now, it's likely that that's probably going to be making sure that there's good communication with staff, with volunteers. If it's a larger charity or perhaps one that is well known within the local community, there might be interest from third parties, either on social media or through mainstream press or things like that. So the leadership are probably going to want to take the role around anything that comes off the back in terms of communications. But making sure they understand what their role is, that it's written down as part of that plan, will make sure that they really focus in on what they should be doing and don't get in the way of the kind of resolution of the technical problem in the first place. Have you practiced? A lot of the time there is a plan in place. It is a perfect plan in a perfect world, but unfortunately a cyber attack doesn't leave you in a perfect world. So making sure that you've got your plan in place and then you've exercised it is really critical. To help you do that, we launched a tool earlier this year called Exercise in a Box. That's the logo up on your screens now. It's a free to use tool. It's on our website. We'll make sure the link is available afterwards. But it gives you 5 tabletop scenarios and 1 technical exercise to help test how prepared your organization is. And it's a business continuity tool. So it allows you to test scenarios such as, we've received a phishing email that then leads to a ransomware attack, or one of our third-party suppliers has suffered a cyber attack that is now sort of reaching over and affecting our organization. So it takes you through those, and it gives you literally everything you need to know to run that exercise, from who needs to be in the room for your organization, how many facilitators you might need, right down to how many flip chart paper and pens you're going to need to be able to deliver the exercise. So it's definitely worth having a look at. It's free to use. You can use it whether you're a charity, a business, government, or anything really. We've actually just opened that up worldwide as well. So if you're an international charity and you have staff operating in other countries, they should be able to access the tool as well. And as anyone that's kind of run those exercises before will know, the most important part of all of that is understanding what you learned from that exercise. So if you're going to do exercise in a box, for example, it gives you a tailored report at the end that tells you the areas that you need to work on, and directs you to appropriate guidance for your organization. But understanding what you learned, reporting that up to the board so that if they need to take action off the back of it, they can, will definitely help to make sure that you've actually taken away that learning and your organization becomes more secure as a result. That's it for me talking at you guys for today. I'm going to pass back to Chris, because I think there's some questions.
Yeah, thanks. Excuse me. Thanks very much again, Cove. Another really insightful webinar there, and some real tangible takeaways for charities to to level up to their, not only their board and the trustees, but to the leadership as a whole. Mm-hmm. If you want to submit a question, we've got a few coming in so far. You can do so by hitting that Q&A button on the sort of bottom center left of your screen. Got a few in already, but keep them coming. But just to take back to that sort of leveling things up to the board and into the leadership, it's often quite helpful to have really useful examples. So have you got any really strong examples of how charities have been affected by cybercrime?
Yeah, so the couple of examples I'll give two here. So we there was a story in the newspaper about 6 months ago. A very large international charity, I think it was actually their US office, but they had been working with the supplier for quite a while. Someone's email account had been compromised, someone fairly senior involved in the finance of that contract. The attackers had looked and waited until an invoice was due for a quite substantial amount. And what they'd then done is when that invoice came in, they'd effectively grabbed it because they were in that person's email account, changed the bank details on it, and then resubmitted it to finance. And in the end, that charity transferred $2.1 million out of their own account into the account of cyber criminals. Now that's quite a large charity. That's a very large kind of example of it. But we see these kinds of attacks really regularly. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations do fall for them. And the controls a lot of the time aren't going to be technical when it comes to that. It's going to be making sure that there's always two people signing off any invoice so that you can check that, yeah, we definitely meant to pay that. And that it's definitely the right people. If somebody wants to change their bank details, pick up the phone to them on a number that you know, and make sure that it definitely was them saying that. Yeah. And if necessary, actually, go back to paper and pen, get them to fill in a new bank mandate form, and make sure that actually it really is them and that they want it to go to that account. But then we've seen some slightly different ones. So a few years back, I think it was right back in 2012, the British Pregnancy Advisory Service suffered a horrible attack where what we call a hacktivist, so someone who has a political grudge against a particular organisation, took umbrage with the work that the BPAS was doing, and I believe got hold of some data through their website, and was threatening to release that data unless some of the conditions that they had were met. And unfortunately, that could have led to some really sensitive data about people submitting around their own personal health and things like that getting out there. That incident was resolved quite well, but we're seeing it affecting charities in a whole number of ways.
Yeah, they're really quite conniving, aren't they?
Yeah.
There's no sort of laws that won't stupid. I think I've mentioned on a few of these webinars previously that we actually get a lot of phishing attacks all the time. Yeah. And there was one, I'd only been here sort of a few weeks, when I was emailed from Jonathan, someone pretending to be Jonathan, asking to go and purchase sort of hundreds of pounds worth of MasterCard, prepaid MasterCards. And if it wasn't thankfully I questioned it and thought this is a bit odd, but so it can truly happen to anyone at any charity at any time. So there's not a lot to be said for that. Sticking with sort of that trustee theme, so are trustees or boards more at risk than other people within charities?
So trustees themselves aren't more at risk than anyone else. What they are, though, is very senior. And criminals are really good at the social engineering side of things, tricking people into doing things that are completely against what they want to do, but making them sound like it's the right thing. So a lot of the time we've seen cyber criminals impersonating trustees, impersonating chief execs, and trying to convince people to do things off the back of it. Pretending to be them. And if, it's not very often, a lot of staff or volunteers will get an email from the chair of trustees or the chief exec. And if they do, they immediately want to be helpful. People's natural instinct is to be helpful. So they will quite often be willing to go around a policy or a process because it's someone who they think is very senior, who's asked them to do something. And they'll often say, I'm so sorry, I've just run out of the office and unfortunately I've forgotten to pay this invoice, or give this person access to the system. Can you just do it and I'll fill in the form on Monday? A lot of people, because they don't work with the trustees or the chief exec on a daily basis, might think, well, maybe that's just how they operate. They're obviously very busy. I'll be very helpful on this occasion. And unfortunately, it's that helpful nature that's causing a lot of people to then fall victim. So I don't think any chief exec or trustee in the land is going to be upset that someone just double checks, picks up the phone to them, or says, does so-and-so, the chief exec, normally send emails like this at 4 o'clock on a Friday? And I can guarantee you a lot of them will come in at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, where they know that probably a few people are left early, it's a skeleton crew, and they are just trying to trick people into doing something they don't want to do. But trustees are a likely candidate for being impersonated.
Very helpful. So we had a question here from Jiri, I think the name is. Sorry, apologies if I've got that wrong. What does the NCIC recommend for email security, digital signature, PGP, encryption, any other alternatives?
So I'm going to slightly dodge this question and say the answer will very much depend on what it is you're trying to protect against. We've got a really good collection around email security on our website. If you visit the NCIC website, we'll make sure that the link goes out afterwards. There's a lot of advice depending on the type of data that you're trying to send, what type of organization you are, and how much kind of availability versus confidentiality matters to you as an organization. There's different levels that we kind of encourage people to use, but we'll make sure that collection is available to Julie afterwards.
We'll add that to our resources that we send out as well. Next question from Caroline. We are entirely cloud-based, for example, SharePoint Online database, Zero, etc. And we have been asked by the local council to have penetration testing. We aren't sure whether we can, as it relies on all the other providers. Do you have any advice on this?
Yeah, so you definitely can get some penetration testing. And I'll just sort of remind everybody, we've got a certified penetration testing scheme where NCIC has assessed people against the criteria for how to deliver penetration testing. And what they're likely to do, I would guess, depending on exactly what it is that the council is asking to be tested, is to test how easy it is to breach those cloud systems. So for example, looking at, do you have two-factor authentication turned on for people to be able to get into your cloud email or some of the online systems that you're using? Looking at if you do have any non-cloud based systems at all, how secure they are they leaving open vulnerabilities? But obviously everybody's also got individual machines that they'll use to actually get access to those cloud systems, and looking at whether there's sensible procedures and policies in place around that as well. So it's definitely worth having a look at our certified scheme, getting in contact with a couple of them, explaining the context, and just seeing what it is that they'd offer. It might be that you have to go back to the council with what it is the penetration testers are saying they can test, and see if that will satisfy the needs of I guess, the contract that you're bidding for with the council or might already have.
Sounds good. Next question from Mike. Do UK companies test for NIST, or do we have to go to US companies?
There are there are companies in this country who can certify against NIST. I believe we don't certify any of them because it's not our scheme. But if you have a look on the site for NIST, which is I think it stands for the North American Institute of Standards and Technology. I always get that wrong, but it's something along those lines.
About right.
Yeah, I've definitely got the right letters in the right order. But if you have a look on their website, they should provide a list of testers, and it is definitely an international scheme. So I do believe there is some testers in this country, but it's also just quite a useful standard to have a look at yourself, and perhaps even do an internal review against, even if you don't go for the full certification.
Magic. So you talked a little bit about suppliers throughout your presentation there. Is there a standard that charities should be mandating for their suppliers?
It will very much depend on what it is that supplier supplies. Now, its chances are you're not going to look for the same standard from the people that supply your stationery and your toilet paper and things like that, as you are going to look for a standard from somebody who provides your IT services, perhaps provides a contract for your database, maybe something like that. So it's worth probably coming up with, going back to the crown jewels, what is it you care about most? Which bits do you really want to invoke a really high standard for your suppliers on? It's likely that those are going to be more the connected things within your organization. And consider for them certainly mandating something like Cyber Essentials, but particularly if it's dealing with more sensitive data, having a look and seeing if they're accredited to ISO 27001. Increasingly, government is moving to having Cyber Essentials as the minimum standard for bidding for contracts. I think in some of them it is now compulsory, and we're certainly moving in that direction. But certainly setting standards within your own organisation, particularly if you've taken a really proactive approach to cyber, you really don't want to be let down by one of your suppliers kind of being that weak link in the chain. So making sure that they are at least near or at the standard you're at is a really kind of good way to help assure yourself.
Yeah, and we've got one of our previous webinars actually covered Cyber Essentials in a lot more depth. So you can find out more information about that through our webinar page. Next question from Paul. We use the Google Suite for the majority of our data storage and email comms. My boss believes Google is secure enough though I have read about implementing third-party backups for cloud data storage. What would your recommendation be? So
I won't make it an exact recommendation, but what I will say is we have seen some cyber attacks where and this is quite a complex one. I don't know how big your organization is, so I'm going to kind of talk through it, but bear in mind this was a very targeted attack where in the event of a ransomware attack, it used to be that they would lock down the systems, but actually if you had backups already, you just wipe down your system, reinstall from the backup, and it was really simple. We've seen a number of attacks, and we released an advisory about it a couple of weeks back, where the attackers have actually got into the system, they've switched off the cloud backups, they've then waited a couple of weeks, deployed the ransomware, and you can't restore from the backup because you've just lost 2 weeks of really critical data. So G Suite as a platform is perfectly good. I mean, most of the mainstream suppliers, Microsoft, AWS, G Suite, are all, they've built up reputations of being quite secure. And I know there's software licenses available through the Charities Digital Exchange. So definitely have a look at those for the pricing as well. But they're perfectly good, but it may be, particularly if that data is particularly sensitive and your organization really couldn't survive without it, then it would be worth considering having that separate backup as well. The key is to make sure though that the simple controls are in place around even gaining access to the G Suite in the first place. So turning on two-factor authentication, particularly for any administrators on the system, but ideally for all of your staff, anyone dealing with data, and making sure that you're, perhaps whitelisting access only from certain devices and things like that.
Yeah, again, something like this was something very similar. This happened to us a while back where we got sort of infiltrated and someone had changed all our 301 redirects to go somewhere completely random. And since then we've implemented the two-step, it's the Google Authenticator that we go through now. And that's, solves everything essentially. There's a lot of merit in actually what's being said.
You can make it quite easy in terms of that it only activates two-factor authentication when you log in from a new device or things like that, or it only makes you do it every 30 days on the same device and things like that. So it used to be really onerous and you'd have to go and get a different device and it would take 10 minutes to log in. It's all a lot easier and a lot smoother on most of the main platforms now.
I mean, even what we use, I think we've got it set up so every time you log back into the back end of the site, you have to go through. It's as simple as, everyone's got a smartphone now. You go on the app on your phone, you get a 6-digit code and that's at your back end. It takes all of 30 seconds, but worth it in the long run to not lose your site for a few days or even hours in some cases. We've got one question left, so if you do want to get any questions in, please submit them now. So the last question is from Jiri again. I apologize if I'm getting your name wrong. How do we sign up to receive an NCIC advisories on the new threats and vulnerabilities on a regular basis.
Yeah, so if you go, there's two ways you can do it. We have the NCIC website, which you visit, it's ncse.gov.uk/advisories. You can subscribe to our RSS feed on there, which will give you all of the ones that we publish weekly. So we publish a weekly threat report, and then obviously more significant things, like, for example, there was an issue with VPNs recently. We released an advisory. We've done one for those ransomware attacks as well. Those all go on there. Or if you are someone who's responsible for cyber within your organization, we have a platform called CISP, which is the Cyber Information Sharing Partnership. Again, it's available from our website. We'll make sure the links are available afterwards. But it's essentially a secure forum, only open to organizations, so not regulators or anything like that. But it's basically, it's a peer sharing platform where we will also put up some of the more sensitive alerts that we wouldn't be able to publish on our website. If anybody wants to sign up to that, they can. They just need to put me as a sponsor. My details are on the screen now, so you just put cubl as the name and cub.l@ncsc.gov.uk as the email address, and I will happily sponsor any charities that want to get onto the platform.
Thank you very much. Oh, we have had a last question coming right at the death there. Well done, Mike. Cub, are you able to come in and brief senior leaders of charities about what you have been talking about?
For now, we'll say not on a one-to-one basis. The reason for that is at NCSE, we are quite a small team. We're a team of 2. But what we do have is the Cyber Protect network. So that's a network of Cyber Protect officers within police forces. There's now at least one in every single police force around the UK. What we can do is put a link to the Cyber Protect network where it's available on our website. They're essentially police officers who specialise in cybersecurity and can do very similar briefings to what I've done just now. But what I would definitely encourage your leaders, your board, to do is have a look at the board toolkit, particularly the first couple of chapters where it tries to debunk some of the myths around cybersecurity, and get them to have a look at that. That link was available at the beginning of the webinar and will be available afterwards as well. But the Protect network is definitely where you want to start with that. You can't see,
can't see Mike's response, but it is boom with a question mark, exclamation mark. Sorry. But Mike, another way is the NCIC will be at our conference. So
yes.
If you want to just jog yourself down there, I'm sure you can pull Cubs here for a minute or two there.
You can have 10 minutes to the conference. That's
champion. Well, that seems to be the last of the questions. So we're gonna wrap up here. Huge thank you once again to Cub. Another amazing session.
No
Thanks
worries.
very much for joining us. And of course, thank you all who attended today. Can't do this without you. As I mentioned earlier, and we've mentioned throughout, we will be sending out a recording of the webinar along with the many resources that we did talk about. We'll make sure to include them all in there. And they'll be hitting your inboxes in the next week or so, so make sure to look out for that. And we also upload everything to our website as well for you to go and interact with whenever you need to, and share with your friends and colleagues, of course. It would be really helpful if you would take sort of 2 minutes to fill in our feedback form that we'll send out right after the webinar. It does go a long way to really helping us sort of mold and shape our webinar program as we look to sort of bring more webinars in the future. So please do take the 2 minutes to do that. Would be really appreciated. Well, and that's the last for Cub for now, actually. So sad faces all round. If you want to catch up with any of the previous webinars we did talk about throughout, you can do so by heading over to our resources page on the website and then hit webinar on our site, or you can simply go to the charitydigitalnews.co.uk/webinars URL. And also, we've mentioned the conference a few times, so don't forget to head over to charitydigital.org.uk/BeMoreDigital2020 to register your interest. Thank you all again, and see you next time.